This is number 4 of the PowerPoint presentations on the Thessalonian letters. It deals with 2 Thessalonians Chapter 2, the passage on the man of lawlessness. This is generally considered one of the hardest passages in Paul's writings. The easy way out, it would appear, would be to simply take it literally and place its expected fulfillment in the future. This is what most popular literature on the end time does. However, this would mean that Paul is writing here about things that, as we now know, have no bearings on the Thessalonians whatsoever, since they were in the distant future. It would force us to believe that none of this had any reality or fulfillment in the first century. And even this interpretation would not be simple at all. Just witness the endless flow of end-time books trying to figure out what is next on God's end-time calendar and how these pieces in chapter 2 fit in. There is no agreement. For an example, just listen to this list of candidates proposed for the man of lawlessness in the 20th century. I'm sure it's very incomplete. There's Mussolini, Hitler, Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Henry Kissinger, Ronald Wilson Reagan, 6 letters in each name making 666, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, Anwar Sadat, Kurt Waldheim, Willy Brandt, Jimmy Carter, Karl von Habsburg, Muammar Gaddafi, Gorbachev, King Juan Carlos of Spain, Pat Robertson. Most of these people have something in common. They're dead by now, and if not dead, so old that they are unlikely to emerge as the man. Such speculation about the man of lawlessness or about the Antichrist is nothing new. It didn't start in the 20th century. Virtually every pope has been branded the Antichrist by at least someone, and many considered the papacy as an institution the Antichrist. The same has happened to the Turks, the Church of England, the Anabaptists, and many other groups. In 17th century England, such Antichrist fever ran very high, especially around the middle of the century. This was the time of the Civil War, when Oliver Cromwell took control of the country. So the question arose, could he be the man of lawlessness? Someone discovered that Cromwell's names and titles added up to 666. There you have it. The fact of the matter is that at this time in England, everybody and everything was called the Antichrist or the Beast by at least someone. One commentator remarked, Anabaptists see new Antichrists everywhere. Apparently, there's nothing new under the sun. You may be interested to hear that in the 17th century, the lettering around English coins added up to 666. So true believers should not have bought or sold anything to avoid the mark of the beast. Well, with this, Antichrist mania escalated to such absurd heights that it turned self-destructive and largely died out in England, at least for a while. The Middle Ages too knew plenty of speculation on the man of lawlessness as well. As I said, there's nothing new under the sun, but we don't really have time to explore that further. I think this shows if God's aim with this chapter was to prepare the church so he could recognize the man of lawlessness when he appeared, the chapter must be deemed a total failure. But perhaps that never was the aim. Paul actually states his aim for discussing this topic. It's not to inform the Thessalonians and enable them to identify the man of lawlessness. He wants them, especially in 2 verse 2, to not be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed in connection with the second coming. Let no one deceive you. Everything else in 2 Thessalonians Chapter 2 is brought in to support this call for composure. We have usually overlooked this in our study of prophecy. All too often we too have been swayed by the newest insight and the newest revelation or publication. Paul's aim also is to counter any false claims in the form of a letter or word or spirit, as he suspects this is what is stoking the fire of hype and excitement in Thessalonica. And that is also why in 3 verse 17 he gives instructions as to how to recognize when the letter is indeed from him. His own handwriting is the mark, sort of the signature, that should enable the Thessalonians to recognize letters, his letters coming from him or false letters in the future. Now, before we look at the elements Paul includes in chapter 2 and consider possible fulfillments, let's first ask for the origin of these ideas. Where did Paul get all of this? Well, there are two lines in the Old Testament, as well as in Jewish tradition, the whole apocalyptic and prophetic expectation that was built on the Old Testament scriptures. Two lines in Jewish tradition that contributed to the ideas Paul is presenting here. The first one is the idea and the expectation of a tyrant, a God king, a ruler who opposes God and his people and claims to be divine himself. We find this idea most clearly in the book of Daniel. Antiochus Epiphanes, a ruler in the 2nd century BC, fulfilled significant parts of Daniel's prophecies, but not all. And so he became a prototype for a future ruler claiming divinity, going against God and his people. And then there's the expectation of a false prophet, later linked with the lying spirit of Belial or Belial. This is more a religious than a political figure. He's a deceiver. Both lines can be found in the New Testament, most clearly in these 4 places. Jesus warning against false prophets, false teachers, and false Christs, as he does in the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13 and its parallels. Then Paul's concept of the man of lawlessness, John's concept of the beast in the book of Revelation. Actually, there's 2 beasts there, one more political, based on raw power and claiming to be divine, and the other more of the deceiving and religious kind. And then there's John's writings on the Antichrist, or Antichrists, plural, in 1st and 2nd John. 1st John chapter 2, chapter 4, and 2nd John verse 7. Now, that's the only place in the Bible where the term Antichrist appears, these 2 letters of John. Now, very often these 3, man of lawlessness, beast, Antichrist, are thrown into the same basket, assuming without any thought or discussion that they are the same. Even though Paul never uses the word Antichrist ever, commentators will habitually refer to the Antichrist in their interpretation of 2 Thessalonians Chapter 2. As I said, the term only appears in John's letters and nowhere else. And there are differences, even though there are also connections. These passages all borrow from the same 2 lines in Jewish beliefs about the end times, but in different ways. John's antichrists are purely religious figures, false teachers emerging from the church, denying the coming of Christ in the flesh. John's beast is first and foremost Rome and its emperor. And Paul? Well, Paul's presentation may have been influenced by something that almost happened a decade before he wrote this. At that time, Gaius, or Caligula, was emperor, ruling from AD 37 to 41, and the following events took place. In a town in Israel, Jews pulled down an altar that had recently been installed in honor of Gaius. This happened in AD 40, and when Gaius heard of it, he commanded the military commander of Syria, Petronius, to march in with his army and set up a gigantic statue of Gaius in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, obviously, this was a major crisis. A Jewish deputation to Petronius warned him that the whole nation would rise up and die rather than allow the temple to be desecrated. It is reported that when Herod Agrippa, actually a friend of Gaius, heard of it, he fainted on the spot, realizing the seriousness of what was about to happen. Petronius tried to dissuade Gaius from doing this, which enraged the emperor, that his army commander would dare to argue against his command. But he did listen to Agrippa and cancelled the order, and was murdered shortly after. So nothing actually came of it. So what Paul's writing here, if taken literally, came close to happening just 10 years earlier. So Paul had no reason to adjust or broaden his presentation, but it's far more difficult to imagine such a literal fulfillment today. So in summary, what we have is two lines of origin, or two sources, coming together in the New Testament, leading into three somewhat different conceptions or directions. This, I think, has consequences when we start thinking about fulfillment, or probably better, fulfillments, plural. It makes it less likely we are to look for one single thing. If we take one of these New Testament passages separately, it appears to provide us with a sharp picture. But if we take them together, the picture becomes anything but sharp. How do the man of lawlessness, the two beasts in Revelation, and the Antichrist relate? Now, we'll come back to this question of fulfillment, and with this we have already covered quite a bit about the man of lawlessness. Let's look at some of the other parts, some of the other elements Paul refers to before we come back to the question of fulfillment. First, there's the rebellion. Now, this term can mean apostasy or falling away, that is, of God's people. This appears to be the idea in Daniel 11, in the Olivet Discourse, and also in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1 and 2, and 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 through 5. These last two passages actually imply that Paul saw something like this already happening in his own time, not 2,000 years later. The word rebellion, the term, can also refer to a rebellion of the world against God, as in Ezekiel's Gog of Magog, recycled in Revelation 20. It fits well with the idea of lawlessness, but it is open to both a religious, spiritual interpretation and a more political one. So closely linked with the man of lawlessness is this rebellion, this falling away, or this turning against God. Then the man of lawlessness takes his seat in the temple. If this has not happened yet, and if the temple is literal and Jewish, it follows that the temple in Jerusalem will have to be rebuilt. This is an important reason many end-time books believe that that is what will happen. The temple in Jerusalem will have to be rebuilt. But those two ifs if it hasn't happened yet, and if the temple is literal, these two ifs are far from certain. Usually, Paul uses temple as a metaphor for the church. In that case, the man of lawlessness could be predominantly a religious figure. Paul does not clearly portray him as a ruler. That idea comes from John's beast in Revelation. The reformers thought it was the Pope, since he claimed to represent Christ on earth. Now, it's also possible that we should think of neither physical temple nor Christian church. It could be an image for a human, or for humanity at large, taking divine prerogatives and taking God's place, refusing to acknowledge or worship Him. Then third, there's the restrainer. This is quite an unclear element. Paul states that the Thessalonians know. He had told them about it. And that's unfortunate, because it means he doesn't have to repeat it. They know. He doesn't explain himself, and so we're left guessing. The restrainer is neuter in verse 6. What is restraining? And it's masculine in verse 7. He who now restrains. So that's a difficulty. And here are some of the suggestions that have been made over time. It could be the emperor or the Roman Empire. This would explain the switch from neuter to masculine. It could be more generally government. After all, one of the functions of government, perhaps its main function, is to restrain evildoing and crime. It could be Michael or archangels or angels in general, an angelic force that restrains lawlessness in the world and prevents the man of lawlessness from revealing himself. It could be God himself in his sovereignty, restraining evil. A popular idea that has little going for it is the church. And this is, of course, based on the assumption that the church is raptured years before the visible second coming of Christ. Or, related to this, the idea that it's the Holy Spirit who's taken away from the earth in the rapture together with the church. Something like this. Government and God himself sound most reasonable, but the bottom line is we don't know. So, back to the question of fulfillment. Is all of this still to be fulfilled? Or was it fulfilled at some point in the past? Or is the answer more complex than this? It's a yes or no question. Here are some of the possible past fulfillments that have been proposed. Maybe the man of lawlessness was one or some of the Roman emperors who claimed to be gods. Maybe the fulfillment took place in AD 70. The Roman soldiers, after capturing the city, sacrificed to their standards, representing the emperor, in the temple area. We've already seen the Pope or the papacy have been proposed. Based on the assumption that the restrainer is the Roman Empire, what came after the Roman Empire? Well, the institution of the papacy, claiming, in the eyes of the reformers at least, to be God on earth. Then there's the possibility that we are not to look for an individual, but for a certain kind of human, for a particular generation or something like that. Interestingly, in verse 8, Paul states that Jesus will kill him, the man of lawlessness, with the breath of his mouth. This is a quote from Isaiah chapter 11, verse 4, where it is said of the Messianic king that he will kill the wicked with the breath of his mouth. In Isaiah, the wicked is not an individual, it's wicked people in general. So it's also a possibility then that the man of lawlessness is a collective term for a certain breed of humans to appear at a certain time, or that appeared in the past at a certain time. Perhaps in our days we could think of something like secularism or a militant form of humanism. Now remember that the combined picture of the New Testament is not that sharp, and a strictly literal fulfillment, think temple, is at the moment not possible. Some significant things would have to happen first to make this even a possibility. Fact is, by now there have been many rebellions and apostasies, a number of manifestations of the beast and the man of lawlessness, and many antichrists. According to John, already at the end of the 1st century there were many. We may even wonder if John, in saying that, was perhaps redefining the prophetic expectation that there was not going to be just one, but many. That too, unfortunately, is not entirely clear, but it's a possibility that John is actually correcting and redefining the expectation of the church on this point. From the Roman tyrants to the mass murderers of the 20th century, how many partial and near fulfillments does it take to be sufficient? Will there yet be an individual who is the culmination and incarnation of human rebellion, in league with Belial or Satan? Perhaps. It's possible. But I wouldn't bet the house on it. The passage does help us to analyze basic patterns and forces at work in any age, including in our own. It helps us to interpret. Again, think secularism, think humanism. But it does not enable us to predict, to say how long, how much longer, or to answer the what and the when. The most important takeaway from this passage, perhaps, is its call for composure. After all, this is Paul's own conclusion towards the end of the chapter. So then, brothers, stand firm and hold to the traditions that you were taught by us, either by our spoken word or by our letter, which of course stands in contrast to that other word or letter that's supposedly going around claiming to be from Paul, and it merely stirs up alarm and troubles. A tongue-in-cheek application of this point would be, don't read stuff like Left Behind, but read more solid material, like the stuff we have in Paul's own writings. So, with this, Paul then also makes room for something more constructive. Doing right, good deeds, the work of faith, the labor of love, the steadfastness of hope. Those are the things he's looking for in the church. A productive life, and of course in chapter 3 he goes on to write about this. It balances out the excitement over the second coming that at times in the church seems to get off track and run out of control. With this, Paul tries to restore the balance, at least in the Thessalonian church, and I think that's something we should take to heart. The real work, the real aim is that work of faith, that labor of love, that steadfastness of hope that Paul wrote about in 1 Thessalonians. This is the end of this PowerPoint.